The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Subjective Age. The inherent aim and effort and justification, the psychological seed cause, the whole tendency of development of an individualistic age of mankind, all go back to the one dominant need of rediscovering the substantial truths of life, thought, and action, which have been overlaid by the falsehood of conventional standards, no longer alive to the truth of the ideas from which their conventions started. It would seem, at first, that the shortest way would be to return to the original ideas themselves for light, to rescue the kernel of their truth from the shell of convention in which it has become encrusted. But to this course there is a great practical obstacle. And there is another, which reaches beyond the surface of things, nearer to the deeper principles of the development of the soul in human society. The recovery of the old original ideas, now travestied by convention, is open to the practical disadvantage that it tends after a time to restore force to the conventions which the time spirit is seeking to outgrow, and if or when the deeper truth-seeking tendency slackens in its impulse, the conventions re-establish their sway. They revive, modified no doubt, but still powerful. A new incrustation sets in. The truth of things is overlaid by a more complex falsity. And even if it were otherwise, the need of a developing humanity is not to return always to its old ideas. Its need is to progress to a larger fulfillment, in which, if the old is taken up, it must be transformed and exceeded. For the underlying truth of things is constant and eternal, but its mental figures, its life forms, its physical embodiments call constantly for growth and change. It is this principle and necessity that justify an age of individualism and rationalism, and make it, however short it may be, an inevitable period in the cycle, a temporary reign of the critical reason, largely destructive in its action, is an imperative need for human progress. In India, since the great Buddhistic upheaval of the national thought and life, there has been a series of recurrent attempts to rediscover the truth of the soul and life, and get behind the veil of stifling conventions. But these have been conducted by a wide and tolerant spiritual reason, a plastic soul intuition, and deep subjective seeking, insufficiently militant and destructive. Although productive of great internal and considerable external changes, they have never succeeded in getting rid of the predominant conventional order. The work of a dissolvent and destructive intellectual criticism, though not entirely absent from some of these movements, has never gone far enough. The constructive force, insufficiently aided by the destructive, has not been able to make a wide and free space for its new formation. It is only with the period of European influence and impact that circumstances and tendencies powerful enough to enforce the beginnings of a new age of radical and effective revaluation of ideas and things have come into existence. The characteristic power of these influences has been throughout, or at any rate till quite recently, rationalistic, utilitarian, and individualistic. It has compelled the national mind to view everything from a new, searching, and critical standpoint. And even those who seek to preserve the present or restore the past are obliged unconsciously or half-consciously to justify their endeavor from the novel point of view and by its appropriate standards of reasoning. Throughout the East, the subjective Asiatic mind is being driven to adapt itself to the need for changed values of life and thought. It has been forced to turn upon itself both by the pressure of Western knowledge and by the compulsion of a quite changed life need and life environment. What it did not do from within has come on it as a necessity from without, and this externality has carried with it an immense advantage, as well as great dangers. The individualistic age is, then, a radical attempt of mankind to discover the truth and law both of the individual being and of the world to which the individual belongs. It may begin, as it began in Europe, with the endeavor to get back, more especially in the sphere of religion, to the original truth, which convention has overlaid, defaced, or distorted. But from that first step it must proceed to others, and in the end to a general questioning of the foundations of thought and practice in all the spheres of human life and action. A revolutionary reconstruction of religion, philosophy, science, art, and society is the last inevitable outcome. It proceeds at first by the light of the individual mind and reason, by its demand on life and its experience of life, but it must go from the individual to the universal, for the effort of the individual soon shows him that he cannot securely discover the truth and law of his own being without discovering some universal law and truth to which he can relate it. Of the universe he is a part. In all but his deepest spirit he is its object, a small cell in that tremendous organic mass. His substance is drawn from its substance, and by the law of its life, the law of his life is determined and governed. From a new view and knowledge of the world must proceed his new view and knowledge of himself, of his power and capacity and limitations, of his claim on existence and the high road and the distant or immediate goal of his individual and social destiny. In Europe, and in modern times, this has taken the form of a clear and potent physical science. It has proceeded by the discovery of the laws of the physical universe and the economic and sociological conditions of human life as determined by the physical being of man, his environment, his evolutionary history, his physical and vital, his individual and collective need. But after a time, it must become apparent that the knowledge of the physical world is not the whole of knowledge. It must appear that man is a mental as well as a physical and vital being, and even much more essentially mental than physical or vital. Even though his psychology is strongly affected and limited by his physical being and environment, it is not at its roots determined by them, but constantly reacts, subtly determines their action, effects even their new shaping by the force of his psychological demand on his life. His economic state and social institutions are themselves governed by his psychological demand on the possibilities, circumstances, tendencies created by the relation between the mind and soul of humanity and its life and body. Therefore, to find the truth of things and the law of his being in relation to that truth, he must go deeper and fathom the subjective secret of himself and things, as well as their objective forms and surroundings. This he may attempt to do, for a time, by the power of the critical and analytic reason, which has already carried him so far, but not for very long. For in his study of himself and the world, he cannot but come face to face with the soul in himself and the soul in the world, and find it to be an entity so profound, so complex, so full of hidden secrets and powers, that his intellectual reason betrays itself as an insufficient light and a fumbling seeker. It is successfully analytical only of superficialities, and of what lies just behind the superficies. The need of a deeper knowledge must then turn him to the discovery of new powers and means within himself. He finds that he can only know himself entirely by becoming actively self-conscious, and not merely self-critical, by more and more living in his soul, and acting out of it rather than floundering on surfaces, by putting himself into conscious harmony with that which lies behind his superficial mentality and psychology, and by enlightening his reason and making dynamic his action through this deeper light and power to which he thus opens. In this process, the rationalistic ideal begins to subject itself to the ideal of intuitional knowledge and a deeper self-awareness. The utilitarian standard gives way to the aspiration towards self-consciousness and self-realization. The rule of living, according to the manifest laws of physical nature, is replaced by the effort towards living according to the veiled law and will and power active in the life of the world and in the inner and outer life of humanity. All these tendencies, though in a crude, initial, and ill-developed form, are manifest now in the world and are growing from day to day with a significant rapidity, and their emergence and greater dominance means the transition from the rationalistic and utilitarian period of human development, which individualism has created, to a greater subjective age of society. The change began by a rapid turning of the current of thought into large and profound movements contradictory of the old intellectual standards, a swift breaking of the old tables.